business for peace in Central America. So with that, Mike, would you come up and forgive my crazy...
There we go. Excellent. Thank you all very much for being here this afternoon, and thank you for that introduction. At my age, I take any introduction I get, and it's great to be with all of you. I was here a couple of months ago with an evening program, and after that it looked like it might be a good idea to come back again, and so I'll just take 30 minutes now to share some reflections on the theme of the day, and also say at the outset that in 1965, I heard some of the first people who had traveled to North Vietnam and came back to talk about a country which at that point the United States had only begun seriously to be at war with. But I can remember the night they came to my little college in a small town in Pennsylvania, and I said to myself, honest to God, what could be more important than going to places in the world with which the United States was at war, staying long enough to listen to people, have some experience of what their lives were like, and then try to interpret that for people in the United States. I was 17, and I began to think that my vocation should be, in amongst other ways of earning a living, because I did have to put bread on the table, but that maybe one piece of my vocation was to go to places where most people had never been, listen, and come back and try to say what I'd seen and heard. In the years at Riverside, I did that in the Soviet Union, was there dozens of times, in the midst of the Cold War still and the nuclear arms race. In Central America, I was there dozens of times during the Contra War and directed Witness for Peace, and during those days we took 4,000 people into active war zones over roads that were mined and in villages that were under attack. And then, starting 15 years ago, I began to go to Venezuela, thinking that that might be, for this season of my life, and this season of the life of the world, the most important place for me to go. And so I went and came back and tried to interpret what I had seen. Not claiming to be an academic expert, not claiming to be a talking head, although I have a talk and I have a head, I do talk, but I'm not a talking head, but to say what I had seen and heard. And so I appreciate every opportunity to do that, because 1965 was a few years ago. You can only catch up with me for 1 month. I retire 1 month from today. So you got 4 weeks. The clock is ticking. But to be with all of you is a great pleasure, and to reflect again on what has happened in Venezuela is a great opportunity. And I count it as a responsibility, since the Venezuelan people have been so open and honest with me. I owe them nothing less. So, having said that, I have 25 minutes, and I'll move quickly. Part of the description of this earlier on in materials that went out was that I would talk about the fact that this is a coup that was 20 years in the making. And I think that's important for a number of reasons. One, to get a sense of the history involved. But secondly, and this is not great news, but it needs to be said, that this didn't start in January of 2017. And if our analysis of the problem is that everything started in January of 2017, we're being sentimental, superficial, and not very helpful. In fact, this is a 20-year consistent project through Democratic and Republican administrations, liberal and conservative and centrist. If you were to sit right now and say 33 issues that you disagree with Donald Trump about, and that all of your liberal and progressive neighbors disagree with Donald Trump about, and then if you were to say, where is everybody dragging their feet in the United States Congress and the US Senate, as if to say, Well, we'll give them one pass. That's Venezuela. You are absolutely convinced, I'm now reading your minds, of 33 things the administration is doing wrong, that are offensive and arrogant, and will only bring upon people more and more suffering. And then there are people who say, but it does look like Venezuela's a real mess. How can they be wrong 33 times and right on this? It's a question. But it's one I've been wrestling with now in recent years. This is a coup 20 years in the making, and so very quickly. In 1998, Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela. He was the first president of Venezuela to be elected on a platform of social reform, and he actually said something that offended the empire from day one. That the fact that they had more oil than any other country in the world, including Saudi Arabia, and that the oil revenues would now be used to benefit the poor majority, was from day one offensive and put the empire on notice that this was someone to watch. In 1999, a new constitution was written and adopted in Venezuela. First one in many, many, many decades. And I can remember my wife and I being there in 2004. We're in a building that was being constructed, and we went to the weekly meeting of the plumbers union in the building. And so in the meeting of their discussion about construction and whether materials are getting there or not, somebody said, well, as the Constitution says, and at that point, 30 guys, my dad was a plumber, so I was familiar with these clothes, 30 guys reached in their pockets and went, I'm sorry, comrade, and they're quoting to each other from the little blue Constitution. They could all read now, and the first book they learned how to read was the Constitution of the Bolivarian Republic, and 30 plumbers were instructing each other on which article applied to what they were talking about. Exactly.
Yeah.
2004 that was. It was adopted in 1999, and one of the things in the Constitution was every official in the country had to be re-elected, from dog catcher up to the president. So in 2000, Hugo Chavez ran for president again and was elected. And so thus began the Chavez era. And for 13 years, Hugo Chavez was the president, and there were remarkable things that took place in Venezuela. Things that by and large I think many of us missed, and which I had the opportunity to see firsthand. 2 million houses built in the poorest barrios in the country and given to people as a fresh start and a new life. 2,000 free eye surgeries that gave people back their eyesight. And then when they gave people back their eyesight, guess what they found out? People couldn't read. And so then they had nationwide literacy that UNESCO said in 2005 had ended illiteracy, and that they were the only country in the world with 100% literacy. 25,000 Cuban doctors, God bless them, offering free Medicare all over the country for a period of 15 years, and they're still there. We saw many, many clinics where people were receiving all medical care free for the first time in their lives. Somebody said to me once, our animals on the farm saw a veterinarian, but I had never seen a doctor in my life. And so, things were happening in the course of those 13 years, but other things were happening as well. 2002, there was a coup that overthrew Hugo Chavez. For 48 hours, he was held against his will, and through the power of the Venezuelan people, a non-violent response to that coup, he came back to power, and it was the first and thus far only time in Latin American history that a coup was reversed by the non-violent power of the people. If we had a functioning university community in this country and an academic community, that might be of interest. How once in a 300-year history, a coup was reversed by the power of the people. That's what happened in 2002. And then they made a decision which was critical for the future. The coup plotters were not executed. They were not tried. They were not exiled. They were allowed to stay if they wished and participate in the political life of the country. And some of the people who are at the heart of what's going on today were part of the coup in 2002. Because, in fact, Venezuela, in the person of Hugo Chavez, actually thought giving people a chance might be the right thing to do. There were people at the time who said in any other country in the world, if they tried to overthrow you, they'd be at least tried, probably imprisoned, maybe exiled, and in some places, worse. Instead, they were allowed to stay. Some preferred Miami, fine, it's a free country. Others stayed and have continued to wreak havoc to this very moment. 2002, the coup, and the reversal of the coup, and something that might be of some interest to people if we have a future. After that, there were also a series of very important developments. You began to see things that had not happened in Latin America before. Countries literally pulling out of the IMF and the World Bank and beginning to use Venezuela as the IMF and the World Bank. The oil wealth made it possible to underwrite social projects in the hemisphere. Every country in the hemisphere, but Chile and Colombia, elected progressive governments. There was a red tide, as Newsweek and Time said, swept across, and it's always the same color. It swept across the hemisphere, and for the first time in hundreds of years, there was a tilt in that direction. In 2006, famously, Chavez went to the UN and spoke at the General Assembly, as presidents of countries or prime ministers are invited to do. And that's where he stood up and said, "I can still smell the sulfur from yesterday because Satan was here." And he was referring to George Bush, and the whole world except for the United States and Israel gathered in the General Assembly, laughed, and said, "Excellent point." Yeah. Two delegations were quiet. The rest of the hall broke out in laughter. He was feisty, he was smart, he was clever. He liked a good fight. He was willing to absorb the punches so that other countries could find their own way. He didn't shrink from that. He actually enjoyed it. It seemed to energize him. And so, given the global spotlight he had, and that line was one that resonated across the globe. 2006. People began to realize that not only were things happening inside the country in terms of oil and where the profits went, in terms of the gap between the rich and the poor, in terms of empowering the poor, not simply giving them programs, but actually having the vast majority of people actively involved in the political and economic life of the nation. And that was all happening in a setting which was still remarkably free. I remember I had a cold one day, sitting in my hotel room in Caracas years and years ago, and I happened to find 59 private TV channels on the TV, all of whom were criticizing President Chavez that day. It was a steady diet. I wasn't very hungry. I didn't have much of an appetite, but it was a steady diet. 59 private TV channels. But literally some days they'd hold press conferences saying there was no freedom of the press, and then that would be covered by, no, it sounds like a joke. And that was covered by the 59 private TV channels, that there was no freedom of the press. 2009, two other important things happened. One, Israel invaded Gaza, and 1,400 people were killed. And Chavez, on his weekly television program, that I was a guest on twice over the course of the years, and we can talk about that in the questions and answers, broke diplomatic relations with Israel and was the only country to do so, saying that they were committing genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. People began to take notice. It's not just oil, it's not just giving people free eye surgeries. was not just loaning money to other countries in the hemisphere. What's going on here? And then with the election of President Obama, the first time and only time that they were in the same room, he went up to Obama, and because Obama had said, if I'm elected, I'll talk to people that people don't talk to usually, and we'll find ways to communicate and have a dialogue and so forth and so on. Okay, that's good. So they found themselves in the same international gathering, and Hugo Chavez, never passing up an opportunity, gave him a copy of Eduardo Galeano's The Open Veins of Latin America, a book that the president had not heard of,
Really?
but every Latin American I've ever talked to has heard of. And so the gift from President Chavez was a book to help our president understand several hundred years of U.S. intervention there. It's 2009. In 2013, Hugo Chavez died. He'd been battling cancer for 3 years, and he struggled with it. He was back and forth to Cuba. It's impossible to capture for cynical, worn-out, well-meaning, good-hearted people who've been battling forever. I'm thinking 1 or 2 people in this room. The unbelievable reverence is the only word I can use, with which the vast majority of people in Venezuela held President Chavez. A woman took me aside once in a very poor barrio in Caracas and said, took me by the lapels and said, do you realize that this is the first president in Venezuelan history who could be my son? She goes, I'm going to repeat that so that you can tell your people that. We've never had a president who could be my son. This man could be my son. I was on the show with him once, and we were in a shoe factory, and there were 150 international guests, and he goes, you guys can sit out there for a while in the sun. I have to talk to the important people. So I went in and went lathe by lathe and talked to the women who were making shoes. Asked them about their lives, how long they've been working there, what they were up to, did they have grandchildren. And then he put his arms around 2 of the oldest women and sang the schlockiest, most unbelievable, romantic Venezuelan love song with his arms around these 2 women. And they were beaming. This wasn't a focus group. This wasn't engineered for a photo op. It wasn't a question of optics. He was interesting. He was smart. He was funny. He was tough. He was resilient. And I think he was the real deal as far as I can tell. And the smile on their faces told the whole story. And when he died, the possibility was that things were over. That momentum that had changed the shape of Latin America, had changed what was happening inside of Venezuela, and had changed the dynamics in the world, with the country with the most oil on the planet was now using it in ways that were problematic for those who had been used to controlling such things. And so 2014, the year after he died, I was there for the first anniversary of his death, and saw how people were remembering that and continuing the struggle as the best way to be remembering. They didn't mourn for him, they organized, although their hearts were still broken. And I think it's hard for us to imagine. In this time in which, when someone dies of some status, we have what the Romans would have called an apotheosis. We have a 7-day ceremony that turns him into a god. And so look what happened with the elder George Bush, who engineered the Iran-Contra affair and all the rest. It's an apotheosis. We have a 7-day excursion into some other reality, making them more than they were in life. And so, after Chavez died, it was not like that, but the people were severely hurt. His designated successor was Nicolas Maduro. He was not Hugo Chavez. He has a different personality, he has a different style, he has a different life. None of us is like each other, so we have to allow ourselves to be who we are, but he was not like that. And so faced with enormous challenges, the last couple of years have been very difficult, But the very first year, 2014, the bottom fell out of the international oil market. The Venezuelan Central Bank last week issued its first report in 3 years about the state of the economy. And in the last 3 years, the economy of Venezuela has diminished by 50%. Some of that are mistakes made by the government. Some of that is continued pressure from the international community led by the United States and Canada at this point. And some of it continues to be, the vast bulk, I would suggest, that what they have been dependent on for 75 or 100 years, oil, that market has been devastated. And so, given all of that, it would be almost impossible for there not to be a painful, grim transition in these years, and then add to it some more recent developments. Sanctions, begun by the Obama administration in 2015, after he was declared, Venezuela was declared to be a unique and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security by the administration. Continued now by the present administration, with sanctions moving now beyond individuals to sanctions imposed on the general economy, which is literally creating death in Venezuela. Mark Weisbrot and Jeffrey Sachs, their report last month said the sanctions have already killed 40,000 people in Venezuela. And so we not only have a situation in which sanctions are being used as they always are, and somehow we sometimes miss this, like it's the kinder, gentler version of something. Sanctions are being used as a weapon of war and are already taking significant tolls within Venezuela. On top of an economy that was already struggling in serious ways. And so then, to close out, to bring it up to the present moment, on January 23rd, Juan Guaido declared himself to be the president. The month before, there had been a public opinion poll in Venezuela just asking about where things stood with people in the opposition and elsewhere, and 20% of the people of Venezuela had actually heard of Juan Guaido. 20%. And then on January 23rd, he declared himself to be the president and used the Constitution, the same one the plumbers pulled out, as his rationale for that, saying that Maduro had lost the ability to govern in a way that was appropriate, and so in the event of that kind of a national emergency, you had the right to declare a new president. What he forgot to read in the next sentence in Article 223 of the Constitution was that you'll hold elections within a month to legitimize your declaration that you're the president. And that was now 110 days ago, and so there have been no elections. Guaido, on the other hand, has continued to be highlighted by the international press and put forward by the United States particularly as the solution to this problem, replacing Maduro and bringing back an old way of doing business. The first week